He ruled more land than any English king before him, stretching from the wilds of Scotland to the sunlit rivers of southern France. He forged the justice system, broke the power of warlords, and reshaped the monarchy with iron law. And yet, when death finally came for him, he was utterly alone. No crown upon his head, no heir at his side, no whisper of prayer, just the cold breath of betrayal and the weight of a name that had devoured itself. His wife was imprisoned by his own orders. His sons waged war against him. His best friend died under his watch, cut down in a cathedral, drenched in holy blood. And when the final list of enemies was read aloud beside his deathbed, the first name wasn't a foreign king. It was his own son. They called him a reformer, a tyrant, a lawgiver, a father. But beneath all the titles, all the armor, all the ink left in the pages of medieval history, he was simply a man who tried to rule a world that refused to obey. And when it didn't, he turned inward, against his allies, against his children, against himself. But this isn't just the story of a king who lost everything. It's the story of how power, once clutched too tightly, begins to rot. How a bloodline once united under a single crown splinters. And how a boy born into civil war, son of a woman who tore England apart for a throne, would rise to rule it all, only to be destroyed by the very legacy he built. To understand why Henry II, the most brilliant king of his age, died with no one left to mourn him, we must go back. Not to the height of his reign, not to the courtrooms or the battlefields, but to the beginning. To the ashes of a civil war. To the cold hands of a mother who would not kneel. To a kingdom already soaked in betrayal before he ever drew breath. He was born into a kingdom already broken. Before Henry II ever opened his eyes, England had collapsed into blood and fire, not from invasion, not from famine, but from the ambitions of his own mother. Matilda, daughter of a dead king, widow of an emperor, and the first woman in England to claim the crown by right, had torn the country in half for nearly 2 decades. Her enemies called it madness. History remembers it as the anarchy. Henry wasn't born in a royal palace, but in a world where loyalty changed with the wind, where nobles pledged oaths in the morning and raised swords by dusk. He learned early that blood meant nothing unless it was spilled. His father, Geoffrey of Anjou, was cold, distant, calculating. His mother, brilliant and relentless, was too busy waging war to raise him. So Henry grew up not as a prince protected by love, but as a weapon forged in isolation. While other boys learned games, he learned tactics. While other heirs were pampered, he was preparing to reclaim a throne soaked in family betrayal. By the age of 14, Henry had already crossed the English Channel with soldiers at his back, daring to stake his mother's claim with steel. He didn't come as a boy, he came as a storm. And though his first invasion failed, it lit a fire in the English nobility. They saw in him something terrifying, not just the son of Matilda, not just a claimant, but a child raised by chaos, willing to burn the world just to seize it. That was the twist. Henry wasn't fighting to heal England. He was fighting to finish what his mother started, only this time without mercy, without compromise. He wasn't interested in rebuilding. He was interested in taking. And the kingdom, already exhausted by years of civil war, looked at this boy with fire in his veins and iron in his voice, and surrendered. But Henry's ascent was never about peace. The war might have ended, But the way he had learned to survive, through dominance, through fear, through blood, would never leave him. The boy who'd been born in the shadow of civil war was about to become a king. And he would rule not with grace, but with absolute control. That control, however, would first demand a marriage, and the woman he chose, brilliant, dangerous, twice his age, would make him stronger and ultimately destroy him. She was the most dangerous woman in Europe, and he wanted her not despite that, but because of it. When Henry first laid eyes on Elena of Aquitaine, she was already a queen, already twice his age, and already infamous. She had just divorced Louis VII of France, publicly, humiliatingly, leaving behind one of the most powerful thrones in Christendom. Most men saw scandal. Henry saw a kingdom. Marrying Elena wasn't just an affair of the heart, it was an acquisition of territory, a union of two wolves. With her came Aquitaine, a vast and volatile realm of wealth, rebellion, and pride. Overnight, Henry's claims stretched across more land than the King of France himself. But what no one expected, what no one could control, was the fire that burned between them. This wasn't love. It was power drawn to power. Two egos orbiting each other like blades, bound by attraction but fated for blood. At first, they were unstoppable. Together, they brought order to a fractured kingdom. Together, they produced 8 children, each one a future weapon in the dynastic chessboard. Together, they made England terrifying again. But Henry didn't just marry a duchess. He married a woman who had once led armies, who had outplayed kings, who knew how to bide her time and when to draw her knife. Elena had been silenced in the French court. She would not be silenced again. And as Henry grew colder, more controlling, more obsessed with centralizing power, Elena watched. She waited. She smiled. But she remembered. The marriage that had begun as a force of conquest began to rot from within. Henry took mistresses. Elena turned to her sons. Their shared empire, held together by fear and force, began to show cracks. Yet to the world, they remained the golden couple of Christendom, until the day those cracks split open and spilled royal blood across the realm. But before the betrayal would come, before Elena would light the fire that consumed their sons and tore the crown apart, Henry had to become king. Not just in name, but in absolute, unchallenged, unforgiving reality. And to do that, he would first have to crush what was left of the lawless, feudal England he had inherited, and reshape it in his own brutal image. He didn't inherit a throne. He took one that had been shattered and rebuilt it with fear. When Henry II was crowned in 1154, England was less a kingdom than a graveyard of loyalties. Barons ruled like kings in their own right. Castles loomed like claws, each one daring the crown to challenge its power. The country had spent 2 decades tearing itself apart under the rule of weak men and weaker oaths. Henry came to end all of it. He moved fast. In less than a year, dozens of illegal castles were razed to the ground. Lords who defied him were stripped of titles, lands, and in some cases, their tongues. He centralized power with surgical cruelty. Royal sheriffs were installed, royal courts reactivated, and a terrifying new structure began to take shape, one that no longer answered to bloodline or birthright, but to the cold will of the king. Henry didn't believe in chaos. He believed in order, but order in his hands was never gentle. He created the exchequer, a system to track every coin, every levy, every breath owed to the crown. He rebuilt the army not by feudal summons, but with scutage, money paid in place of service, ensuring that his soldiers fought for gold, not divided loyalties. He created circuits of traveling judges to enforce royal law in every corner of the realm, wielding justice like a blade. And yet, for all his genius, there was something in Henry that never rested. Some dark engine behind the eyes, constantly turning. He paced, muttered, lashed out at shadows. His rage was volcanic, quick to ignite, impossible to predict. He ruled with brilliance, yes, but also with paranoia. Every baron was a threat, every delay a challenge, every question a sign of disloyalty. What he was building wasn't just a stronger England. It was a reflection of his own mind. Organized, efficient, unbending, and always on the brink of violence. But to truly control this kingdom, not just its nobles and its courts, but its soul, Henry would need to conquer something older, deeper, and more dangerous than any baron. He would need to bend the church, and to do that, he would elevate a man he believed he could trust, a man whose loyalty was unquestioned, his closest friend, his shadow, Thomas Becket. He thought he was placing a blade into the scabbard. Instead, he handed it to the executioner. When Henry raised Thomas Becket to Archbishop of Canterbury, it wasn't just a promotion, it was a move of total control. Becket had been his loyal chancellor, his drinking companion, his mirror, the perfect servant. And now, Henry believed, the perfect weapon to bend the English church to his will. But the moment Becket put on the robes of God, something in him changed. The courtier became a priest. The servant became a guardian. And instead of obeying the king, Becket began to resist him publicly, fiercely, and with a moral fire that Henry couldn't extinguish. It wasn't politics, it was war. Becket defied the king's reforms, refused to sign royal edicts, and turned the church into a rival throne. The man who once laughed at Henry's side now stood in front of cathedrals, excommunicating his officials one by one. Henry was not used to betrayal, especially not from those he had raised himself. It infuriated him not just as king, but as a man. The bond they had shared, the trust he had placed in Becket, now felt like a dagger twisting in his side. The tension escalated. Letters turned to threats. Smiles became silence. Henry tried to break him. Becket fled to France. But exile only sharpened his resolve. When Becket finally returned, cloaked in black, the people bowed, but the king's fury boiled over. In the winter of 1170, in a fit of drunken rage, Henry muttered words that history has never forgotten. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights heard the words and took them as an order. They rode to Canterbury, entered the cathedral, and in front of the altar before the gaze of God, they cut Becket down like an animal. Skulls split, blood on the stones, no trial, no mercy, just a priest, once a friend, now a martyr. The scream that followed was Henry's, it was Europe's. Becket's murder shocked the continent. The church recoiled, the people wept. And Henry, the Iron King of Order, found himself hunted not by armies, but by saints. To keep his throne, to keep his soul, he would have to do something no king of England had ever done before. Strip himself bare and crawl into the hands of the church he tried to control. He had ruled with steel, now he knelt in rags. The murder of Thomas Becket had turned Henry from monarch to marked man, not by sword, but by silence. The Pope threatened excommunication. Pilgrims flooded Canterbury to touch the blood-stained stones where Becket had fallen. Saints were speaking, miracles were whispered, and all across Christendom one name was cursed, not the knights who swung the blades, but the king who had summoned the storm. Henry knew what had to be done. He crossed the sea to Becket's tomb, not with a crown on his head, but barefoot, cloaked in sackcloth, walking through the mud like a penitent. When he reached the cathedral, he stood before the place where his friend had died and knelt. No guards, no throne, just a king broken by the judgment of eternity. But even this wasn't enough. Henry then did what no monarch had ever dared. He lay face down on the stone floor and invited the monks, men loyal to Becket's memory, to beat him. One after another, they lashed him with branches and cords, not once, not 10 times, but 80 lashes across the back of the most powerful man in England. And through it all, Henry didn't move, didn't cry out, didn't resist. Because in that moment, he wasn't king, he was sinner. Was it genuine repentance, or was it theater, one final move in the chessboard of power, played with blood instead of words? No one knows, but the act worked. The Pope relented. The Church forgave, the scandal faded, and Henry rose again, not weaker, stronger. Now cloaked in penance, he returned to his throne with more authority than before, but something inside him had shifted. The man who once believed he could rule every soul in his kingdom had just faced a force older and colder than monarchy, the judgment of faith. And from that moment forward, he would never truly trust another human being again. Which meant when the next betrayal came, when it didn't come from a bishop, but from the woman he once called queen, he wouldn't forgive it. He'd crush it, even if it meant destroying his own family. He had survived God's judgment, but he would not survive his wife's. Elena of Aquitaine had waited, through the years of silence, through the lashings at Becket's tomb, through the reforms, the conquests, the mistresses. She had watched Henry become more than a king, something colder, sharper, more paranoid. And while he reshaped the crown into an empire, she reshaped her silence into a weapon. They had once ruled together. Now they barely spoke. Henry kept her close enough to use, but never close enough to trust. She saw her daughters married off like bargaining chips. She saw him take Rosamund Clifford, his pale mistress, locked in a tower, wrapped in legend and secrecy. And she saw what he was becoming, a man so obsessed with order that he no longer saw people, only threats, pawns, and punishments. So Elena did what queens were never meant to do. She plotted. She turned to her sons, young, hungry, bruised by their father's control. Chief among them was Henry, the young king, a boy crowned while his father still lived, but given no real power. Elena fanned the flames of his resentment. She whispered of destiny, of injustice, of a world waiting for a younger hand to lead. And in 1173, with her backing, her sons rose. It was open rebellion. Henry II, king of law, breaker of barons, master of courts, was now being hunted by his own blood. France joined in, Flanders, Scotland. The rebellion burned across 3 kingdoms. The empire he had built with sword and sweat now turned against him, piece by piece, son by son. But Henry didn't break. He crushed it, ruthlessly. He chased his sons across battlefields. He executed their supporters. He captured Elena, his own wife, and locked her away in a remote castle. No trial, no farewell, just stone walls and silence for 16 years. Yet even in victory, something cracked. He had won, but not against foreign kings. He had won against his own children, his own queen. The dynasty he built was now a nest of knives, and the worst wound hadn't come from rebellion. It came when his son, the one he crowned while still alive, the one he raised to rule, died young, alone, and unloved. And even as that boy begged for his father's forgiveness, Henry refused to come. Because for Henry, there was no room left for forgiveness, only control. But the ghosts were beginning to gather, and the next son would not ask permission to tear the crown away. He had buried one son in bitterness. Now another was sharpening the blade. Richard, the tall one, the beautiful one, the war-born, had watched his older brother die pleading for his father's love, and what he learned was simple. Love had no place in a world ruled by Henry II, only obedience, only power. So Richard stopped seeking approval and started preparing for conquest. By now, the royal court was a furnace of quiet hatred. Elena remained locked away, aging behind stone, still dangerous in silence. Henry kept his younger son, John, close, his favorite, his shadow, the one he believed he could still mold. But Richard was the problem. Stronger, smarter, bolder, a lion pacing the edge of the cage. And when Henry tried to carve up the empire to make room for John, giving away pieces that Richard believed were his by right, something snapped. Richard didn't beg. He didn't rebel like his brother. He didn't weep. He went to France, straight to King Philip, the old enemy of his father, and made a pact. They would destroy the King of England together, not with swords, not at first, but with slow poison. Politically, psychologically, piece by piece, Henry's allies began to vanish. Castles turned cold. Vassals hesitated to answer summons. Whispers filled the court. The old king was slipping, and he was. Henry was now aging fast, his body riddled with fever, his temper shorter, his isolation deeper. The man who had once stormed across battlefields was now surrounded by men who no longer feared him, and sons who no longer wanted him alive. By 1189, Richard and Philip had pushed to the edge. War was no longer looming, it was here. Henry, sick and exhausted, was forced to negotiate with his enemies. And in that final moment of humiliation, when he demanded to know the names of all those who had betrayed him, the list was read aloud. The first name was Richard. That broke something no doctor could heal. Henry turned his face to the wall. He spoke no more. Within days he died, beaten not by sword, but by betrayal so complete it silenced even his rage. But if death was a release, it did not come with peace. Because the crown did not rest. It passed from one blood-stained hand to another. And in the wake of Henry's final breath, a new kind of suffering was about to begin, not from a father who ruled with irons, but from sons who ruled with ruin. The moment Henry II died, England didn't breathe, it clenched. Because what followed his fall wasn't healing, it was vengeance wrapped in glory. Richard the Lionheart claimed the throne not as a grieving son, but as a conquering warlord, cheered by crowds that had forgotten or chosen to forget that he had helped kill his own father. The court was washed clean with ceremony, but underneath the gold and incense, the walls still whispered. No one spoke of the list. No one spoke of the silence Henry died in, but the blood hadn't dried. Richard didn't want to rule. Not really. He wanted to fight. He sold off royal lands to fund a crusade, drain the treasury, and vanished east toward Jerusalem. leaving the kingdom in the hands of men who only worshipped coin. England became a machine of extortion. Taxes rose, loyalty turned to fear, and in the vacuum of power, another shadow crept forward: John, the youngest, the overlooked, the one his father had once trusted too much. John watched as Richard burned his inheritance across the Holy Land, watched as enemies gathered back home, watched as nobles began to wonder, what if the lion never returned? And when Richard was captured on his way back, chained and ransomed by fellow Christians, John made his move. He plotted with France. He called himself king. For a year, he tried to seize the crown while his brother sat in a foreign dungeon. It failed. Richard returned and forgave him, but not completely. Trust between them was shattered. And when Richard finally died in 1199, struck down by a crossbow bolt while besieging a minor castle in Aquitaine, it was John who inherited everything. The crown, the empire, the rot. But what John inherited wasn't just land or title. It was the weight of a bloodline devouring itself. The echoes of Elena's whispers, of Henry's punishments, of Becket's ghost still bleeding on cathedral stones. John ruled not as a king born to command, but as a man drowning in legacies too heavy to carry and too cursed to ignore. And from that cursed throne, he began to lose everything: Normandy, Anjou, the loyalty of his barons, the soul of the realm. But to understand how that spiral began, to truly feel the terror behind the crown, one must return to the mind of the man who started it all. A king who thought he could outwit eternity. A king who built an empire only to be buried beneath it. His empire did not collapse with a scream. It crumbled in silence, brick by brick, betrayal by betrayal. What Henry II built was never meant to last, not because it wasn't brilliant, but because it was unnatural, an iron cage forged around people who refused to be ruled. His sons had inherited his lands, yes, but more than that, they had inherited his madness, his hunger, his curse. Richard the Lionheart, the Golden Warrior, died with no heir and no peace. He left behind scorched earth and empty coffers, a legacy of glory soaked in debt and death. But what he truly left behind was John, the son Henry had once favored, the child he had hoped to shape in his own image. But John was not a hammer like Richard, nor a firebrand like Henry the young king. He was something colder, quieter, a shadow walking on the edges of thrones. John's rule was not marked by triumph, it was a slow suffocation. He lost Normandy to the French. He bled the barons with taxes to fund wars he couldn't win. He alienated the church, then groveled to get its favor back. He ruled not as king, but as a cornered beast, every decision defensive, every gesture twitching with distrust. And like his father, he feared love. He feared loyalty, because he believed neither were real. Barons revolted, castles defected. In 1215, his own nobles forced him to kneel and sign the Magna Carta, a document that didn't just limit his power, but humiliated his bloodline. The crown of Henry II, once blazing with unshakable authority, was now little more than a trembling mask. Even the peasants whispered it. The king is no longer feared. And perhaps worst of all, even as John dragged himself toward the end of his reign, bloated, paranoid, hated, there was still one thing that haunted him. Not the rebels, not the French, but the knowledge that everything falling apart around him was never truly his to hold. It had been borrowed from a man who had tried to make kings out of sons, and failed. But Henry II's true failure wasn't in John. It was in himself, in the myth he believed, that he could shape legacy through force, that blood could be bent without ever breaking, that loyalty could be commanded, not earned. And when death finally came for him, it came not from war, nor plague, nor time. It came from within his own veins, from the very sons he once held in his arms. He didn't die in battle. He didn't die in glory. He died facing a stone wall, whispering nothing, surrounded by men who used to kneel but now only watched. In July of 1189, Henry II, once the architect of an empire, the terror of barons, the lawgiver to a kingdom on its knees, lay dying in Chinon Castle. Fevered, betrayed, alone, the list had been read, the names of every noble who turned on him, every lord who took French coin, every ally who became enemy, and at the very top, carved like a wound, Richard, his son. The one he raised in his image, the one he believed would never cross that line. But the line was never real, not to Richard, not to any of them. The sons he forged had not inherited his fire, they had inherited his fury. And now it had turned inward. Henry said nothing after the list. He turned to the wall. He refused food. He refused priests. He refused pity. His body, once built like a war horse, trembled under rot and rage. Some said he whispered in Latin. Some said he just wept. But no one truly knows, because no one stayed long enough to listen. When death finally took him, it didn't feel like a king had passed. It felt like a curse had lifted. The court barely mourned. The barons looked elsewhere. Richard prepared his coronation, and the last rites of the man who once ruled more land than any English king were said by monks in the dark, quiet, efficient, almost relieved. His body was laid in Fontevraud Abbey, wrapped in cloth, placed beside Elena's empty tomb and the memory of a family that had destroyed itself from within. No great monuments, no weeping sons, just a corpse, just silence. But what died that day was more than a man. It was a belief that a crown could bend a bloodline to its will, that brilliance could overcome loyalty, that fear could outlast love. Henry had tested all three and lost. And yet even in death, he cast a long, violent shadow, because the world he built did not vanish. It cracked, it echoed, and the ruin he left behind would become the foundation for even darker kings to rise. Kings who wore the same crown, but ruled with far less restraint. They buried the king, but not the chaos. Henry II was dead, but the world he'd shaped refused to rest. The barons still bled loyalty. The church still held grudges. The lands he ruled, from the stormy coast of Ireland to the wine-rich valleys of Aquitaine, now trembled under the weight of uncertain inheritance. No treaties had been sealed. No peace had been earned. The crown had merely changed hands from one wolf to another. Richard the Lionheart, now king, did not stay to rule. He barely stayed at all. Within months, he had emptied the treasury, raised armies, and vanished eastward for war. His mind was not on England. It was on Jerusalem, glory, and God. And so the kingdom fell into a strange sleep, guarded by men who feared the crown more than they served it. Every inch of stability Henry had once carved with steel began to rot in his absence. And worse still, Richard died childless. His death triggered no triumph, no unity, only a scramble. Into that vacuum slithered John, the youngest son, the one Henry had once held closest. But John inherited nothing clean. France attacked. The barons rebelled. The Pope intervened. And slowly, piece by piece, the empire that Henry had held together through war began to fall apart. Normandy lost. Anjou surrendered. Aquitaine threatened. And England itself, overburdened with taxes, with fear, with betrayal, erupted in revolt. John, desperate, was forced to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, forever limiting the power of kings and chaining the monarchy to parchment and noble consent. It wasn't justice. It was vengeance, years delayed. And yet even then, the old whispers returned. Henry II's name still echoed in courts, in churches, in castles cracking under war. Some remembered his brilliance, others remembered his wrath, but all remembered this, that the age of kings who ruled through terror had not ended with him. It had only mutated, because what Henry left behind was more than an empire. It was a blueprint for cruelty, for control, for how to rule men without ever needing to trust them. A blueprint that future monarchs would study and surpass. He didn't just leave a throne behind, he left a wound that never closed. Henry II's death did not mark the end of a dynasty, but the infection of a lineage. One by one, his sons wore the crown he forged, and one by one, they shattered under it. Not because they lacked strength, but because they had been raised in a kingdom where love was weakness, trust was liability, and power was always personal. Richard the Lionheart died without an heir, pierced by a peasant's crossbow in a forgotten siege, far from the crusades he chased and the glory he could never quite hold. His body was divided across 3 tombs, as if even in death he could not belong to one place. John ruled next, not with honor but with desperation. He lost lands, lost loyalty, lost his soul. The barons hated him. The church broke him. Even the weather seemed to curse him. He died vomiting, raving, deserted by most. A king remembered not for greatness, but for failure. The Angevin Empire collapsed. What was once a machine of law and ambition spanning half of Europe now rotted into fragments. England turned inward. France reclaimed the West. The bloodline of Matilda, of ambition born in fire, was now diluted, haunted, whispered about only in caution. And yet something of Henry remained. In every crown that followed, in every law twisted to serve a monarch's will, in every betrayal justified as duty. Because Henry II was not just a king, he was the beginning of something crueler. The modern ruler, a man who believed in systems more than souls, who wielded family as a weapon, who mistook loyalty for obedience and paid for it with the collapse of everything he tried to protect. He rose from the ashes of a civil war his mother started, and he died in the shadow of a rebellion his children finished. His life was a circle of blood, spilled to claim the throne, spilled to keep it, spilled to pass it on. And in the end, the only thing that survived him was the silence of a crown placed too heavily on too many broken heads. But if you wish to understand how this fire began, how a boy became a king through the ashes of war, then watch the story of his mother, Empress Matilda, the woman who first set England alight. And if you want to see how that same fire consumed the world beyond Henry, then follow it into the hands of his son. Richard the Lionheart, the crowned crusader who chased glory